Thanks. All right. Well, welcome again, everybody. My name is Greta Anderson. I am the Deputy Director of Western Watersheds Project, and we are excited to be presenting you this first ever analysis of NEPA grazing permit renewals across the West. My colleagues today are Melissa Kane and Josh Osher, who will be handling the presentation. They've been doing a lot of work on the analysis. I'm grateful to them for making it accessible to the rest of us. We will run about 20 minutes for the presentation, and then there will be time for a Q&A in the after that. So as we go, if you have questions and want to pop them in the chat, please do so. And then I will facilitate a conversation at the end. So without further ado, we'll get started. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Greta. Really appreciate that. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us this morning and learn about this really important issue for Western public lands, for the broader story about conservation in the United States, what it means for lands to be conserved and well managed, and the nexus between what our land management agencies do on the ground and our efforts to address issues like climate change and the loss of biodiversity and all the other multiple ways that we use and relate to our public lands. So today we're going to talk a lot about the Bureau of Land Management's grazing program. Essentially, the Bureau of Land Management, and I'll be referring to them mostly as the Bureau from here on out, has been failing to manage grazing on public lands to a large extent. The grazing program is the Bureau's largest program by acreage and scope. The Bureau manages about 2 million domestic cows and sheep on about 155 million acres of public lands throughout the Western United States. The Bureau issues grazing permits and leases, typically up to 10-year terms, and they're required by federal law to undergo a public analysis through the National Environmental Policy Act before permits can be renewed. Each allotment is also supposed to be evaluated for compliance with land health standards, which will inform the NEPA process and guide new management direction. The Bureau has largely failed to comply with the law and has a massive backlog of permits that don't have current NEPA analysis and don't have current land health evaluations. Because of this huge backlog that started in the early 2000s, Congress gave the Bureau exemptions from the requirement to have NEPA done before renewing the grazing permits in a series of riders to annual appropriations bills. And these ran in various forms from 2004 to 2014. And the idea was to give the Bureau time to reduce their backlog and catch up on the work. In 2014, the Congress codified this rider with an amendment to FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and they and this was done as part of the last-minute National Defense Authorization Act approval. It was one of the bills in that public lands package that made this rider permanent. And that happened back in 2014. Still, the idea was that the Bureau is still required to do NEPA on grazing allotments. They're still required to evaluate the land health on all their grazing allotments. The Secretary was supposed to exercise their discretion, give priority to certain allotments over others, set up a schedule, do all of these things. That was the expectation. Unfortunately, what we've seen since the codification of this rider in 2014 is the Bureau has actually sharply reduced the number of new NEPA analyses for grazing allotments and is still woefully behind on land health evaluations as well. Melissa's going to walk us through some of the details of this analysis, and you'll get a better understanding of how far behind the Bureau really is.
Thank you, Josh. So Bureau of Land Management lands are divided into what are called grazing allotments. These are discrete geographic units where grazing is authorized through a series of permits. An allotment can have one or more permits on it. Permits determine the number of animals, the type of animals, be they cattle, sheep, horses, or rarely goats or bison. And they determine the time period that livestock can graze on an allotment. They also set the number of AUMs. An AUM is an animal unit month. And that's basically the unit that they use to determine how many animals are out for a given period. An animal unit month is the equivalent of 1 cow and her calf for 1 month, or 5 sheep and their lambs for 1 month. So allotments can be classified based on the way that their permits were reauthorized. And that's what we've done here. We've taken publicly available data from the Bureau of Land Management, and we've classified allotments based on how those permits were renewed. The first classification is fully processed. Those are the ones that have received NEPA, either through an EA, an EIS, a categorical exclusion, or a decision of NEPA adequacy. Some of them have more than 1 permit, and they've been renewed different ways, where 1 permit may have been authorized under NEPA, and 1 or more permits has been renewed using that FLTMA 402C2 exemption. So when we get to those are classified as partial NEPA. Allotments where all permits were renewed using that FLTMA 402C2 exemption are going to be classified as FLTMA 402C2, or prior to it being permanent, it was part of the Appropriations Act. So that's what we'll see in 2013 is the Appropriations Act renewals. And finally, allotments that have some unusual circumstances, such as a decision that's been challenged, are classified as other, but those are pretty rare. So first, we're going to look at 2013. This is the year before Congress granted the Bureau the permanent authority to renew allotments without doing NEPA. So at this time, when the Bureau was approaching Congress and saying, hey, we need to catch up, they were at 28% of allotments and 44% of AUMs that had been renewed with those annual Appropriations Act riders without NEPA. And we see those in red here. By 2017, 3 years after Congress had given them the permanent authority to renew allotments without NEPA, in order to catch up, we're at 38% of allotments and 52% of AUMs. So it's getting worse. Last year, in 2021, we had 54% of allotments and 67% of AUMs on public lands that were renewed without any NEPA analysis whatsoever. We can see by clicking into these maps that some of these allotments have an enormous number of livestock on them. We've got here in Nevada, Condor Canyon has 63 livestock and 640 AUMs. The Rock Springs allotment, a partial NEPA allotment. Oh, sorry, I missed it. The Rock Springs allotment has 315,000 livestock authorized at 107,000 AUMs. This is classified as a partial NEPA allotment because one of these permits did get NEPA. That permit authorized 8 cattle. All of the rest were authorized without any NEPA analysis. The rate of NEPA completion differs by state. We can see this visually. We can also break it down. In Montana in 2021, 28% of allotments and 26% of AUMs were authorized without any NEPA analysis. Montana is doing pretty good. They still have a backlog, but it's not so bad. When we get to Nevada, we've got 88% of allotments and 89% of AUMs that are authorized without any NEPA analysis. Many allotments have been renewed more than once without any NEPA analysis, and those are shown in black and gray here. The gray allotments are partial NEPA and the black allotments are no NEPA at all for 2 cycles, so up to 29 years. In 2021, those authorizations totaled almost 2.5 million livestock and almost 4.5 million AUMs. This is an allotment that hasn't received environmental review since 1999. It's in Idaho. There are almost 2,500 cattle authorized to graze here every year at a rate of 6,700 AUMs. In the last decade, only 2 states have received more than half of their allotments. Only 2 states have allotments that have received NEPA on more than half. And those are Montana and New Mexico. Most states track closer to that Nevada number, between 70 and 80%. Some allotments have never undergone environmental review. The way that the Bureau classifies data, we can't tell. We would have to do a systematic analysis looking at every individual permit to see if they've ever received NEPA.
Thanks, Melissa. So, I mean, I think visually you can understand and why it matters. I mean, we can see the degraded public lands, we can see the scope of the problem. But I want to talk a little bit more about NEPA and why it's important for grazing management. You know, a lot of the handbooks and manuals that the agency uses and kind of at the center of the NEPA process is this idea that NEPA is the heart of the decision-making process. It's really the foundation that allows the government to make good decisions based on the best available information after taking a hard look at the situation and analyzing a series of alternatives. You know, NEPA is the foundational environmental law, and it's really important, especially in grazing management, for a number of reasons. One of the most important reasons we need NEPA on individual grazing allotments is that resource management plans, these overarching plans that the Bureau creates, usually every 20 to 30 years, that guide management of a specific area, they might contain terms and conditions for livestock grazing. They might contain desired future conditions for the land. They might have specific important management prescriptions for wildlife habitat. They can reflect changed circumstances about climate, about wildlife, about recreation, other land uses. But in terms of grazing, not a single aspect of a resource management plan is implemented until the site-specific NEPA takes place on each grazing allotment. So if a district has 700 or 800 grazing allotments within their district and they have a new resource management plan, none of those management prescriptions apply to those allotments, any of those allotments, until site-specific NEPA is completed on each and every one for it to go into effect. So we've seen over the years, you know, the best intentions potentially coming through these resource management planning processes. A lot of work goes in, the public is involved, the agency spends years of time and resources to do analysis. But on the ground, nothing changes because the agencies aren't doing the site-specific analysis to actually implement the prescriptions that are in those plans. So we need that site-specific NEPA on grazing allotments to get resource management plans. The other thing about the NEPA process is it's really the only time that the public has an opportunity to be involved in new management decisions and to really have an understanding of current management of these lands. Considering the scope of the grazing program and the amount of acreage it occurs on, you know, these are pretty much all the recreational lands that the Bureau manages. They're all grazed. This is an activity occurring in all these places. Yet the public who's using those lands, or the public that hunts on those lands or cares about fish and wildlife and plants on those lands, has really no opportunity to engage with the land managers who are responsible for the most pervasive use of those lands, which is livestock grazing. So we need public involvement to engage in the management process. It's a really important component, and it's lacking if we don't get NEPA. You know, grazing allotments that are authorized without NEPA continue status quo grazing. The terms and conditions on the existing permit are continued without any look.
Doesn't have a phone anymore. She can't use a phone, but she's getting an ultrasound today, and then we're gonna
Chandra, can you
go over
please
for
mute?
dinner and birthday cake and stuff, and we can call you. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry about that, guys. So, you know, grazing allotments that are renewed without NEPA analysis continue the status quo management. You know, whatever was going on previously in that permit is still going on with the new permit. You That's true even if the agency is aware that there are problems on the allotment. It's true even if there's at-risk wildlife species that have been recently identified on that allotment. It's true really even if there's endangered species listing that goes and critical habitat designations. Grazing management doesn't change unless there's site-specific NEPA. So we need this to happen in order to address new circumstances. And it's also the only time really that gets the agency doing the land health evaluations. It's the NEPA process that kickstarts the evaluation of what's going on these landscapes. So if we don't have NEPA, we're also not even looking at whether the lands are healthy or unhealthy, what's causing it, what might be done to help it out. So I'm gonna just focus on, a specific example, greater sage grouse, for where this is really problematic. And what we found is that if we look at the allotments, the problems are actually worse for the BLM in the most important habitats, or the ones that you would expect to be the highest priority. We have more allotments being renewed without new NEPA analysis, without land health evaluations, or even where the allotments are known to be failing to meet land health standards, in the areas where we would expect the highest priority for analysis. So greater sage grouse are a great example. In 2015, we had an historic process to amend over 99 resource management plans with new habitat objectives and management prescriptions for greater sage grouse habitat. Basically, a lot of the Western United States was impacted by these changes. And for some activities, they were immediately implemented. For grazing, not at all. Everything was dependent on site-specific analysis. The Bureau committed to prioritizing NEPA and land health evaluations in these sage grouse focal areas, the areas with the highest level of protection. And as you'll see, that's exactly the opposite of what's happened. Those are the areas with the least amount of NEPA analysis, even though we know that a lot of them are failing to meet land health standards and provide good habitat for sage grouse. 7 years after the adoptions of the management plans, having so little site-specific analysis being done and so little implementation of the plans in regards to grazing, it's easy to make the case that adequate regulatory mechanisms are not in place to protect this species and their habitat.
So what we've found in doing an assessment of the overlap of critical species habitat areas and allotments that are being renewed without any NEPA analysis is that it's occurring at a rate greater than the average for all allotments. As we saw previously in 2021, 54% of all allotments were renewed without any NEPA analysis. But when we look at, for example, Gunnison sage grouse, which are a threatened and endangered species, the rate is much higher. In occupied habitat, we've got 59% of allotments that are being renewed without any NEPA analysis. For greater sage grouse, SFA is the highest protection category there is for greater sage grouse. And we've got allotments being renewed at a rate of 69%, down to 56% in GHMA, which is still higher than the average for all allotments. When we look at bighorn sheep are threatened by a pathogen carried by domestic sheep. It causes fatal pneumonia that can decimate entire herds. When we look at the overlap of domestic sheep allotments in bighorn sheep occupied habitat, they're being renewed at a rate of 83% without any NEPA analysis. So that means that there are no changes in grazing management, and the public has no opportunity to weigh in on the fact that we are putting bighorn sheep herds in direct risk by exposing them to domestic sheep who carry these pathogens.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, so-called protected areas. These are the places that in our new analysis for America the Beautiful, the 30 by 30 initiative, these are the GAP 1, GAP 2 lands, national monuments, wilderness areas, etc., the most protected status. You would think that these would be the highest priority for managing impacts to their ability to sustain biodiversity and really maintain those elements that make them important for protection in the first place. I think a lot of people are not aware that the Bureau of Land Management actually manages a lot of these protected areas, and that livestock grazing is substantial. I mean, over 225,000 AUMs just on national monuments the Bureau manages exist. So a lot of grazing is happening on these national monuments. You know, we're going to take, for example, Grand Staircase, the picture that we showed a minute ago there. You know, Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument permits over 83,000 AUMs. Not a single grazing allotment has undergone NEPA analysis since the monument's designation in 1996. And we know from analysis, because this is the science monument, a lot of research has been done there, that livestock grazing is having really significant impacts on the objects of the monument, on the ecology of that landscape. So we have a big problem here that can't be ignored. And it's not going to be good enough to simply say these are protected because of some designation or status. We need to look at what's going on the ground, and make sure that the Bureau is responsible for managing those impacts. I'm going to run through these last two, you know, fairly quickly. This will all be available to you later, but I don't want to take all of the time with the presentation. I want to make sure there's a lot of opportunity for questions. So some of you may have seen that Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility peer released a data set related to land health evaluations and the amount of allotments that were failing to meet land health standards. These are the most basic requirements for land health, not by any means the desired condition for those landscapes, just the most basic conditions that are considered, you know, before the land can be said to be healthy. You know, a lot of the land that the Bureau manages is unhealthy, and a lot of it's unhealthy due to livestock grazing. You would think, again, that these would be the highest priority to address with a new NEPA analysis. Yet we found that 65% of the allotments known by the Bureau to be unhealthy due to current grazing are being rubber stamped for renewal without any environmental analysis. You know, the Bureau has a legal responsibility to change grazing management within the next year, and if an allotment is failing. But it simply doesn't happen if there's no NEPA analysis. The changes that can be made are much more limited and difficult, and we don't get a good look and good alternatives for new management. You know, there's clear evidence that the lands under the Bureau's protection are unhealthy due to grazing, and the Bureau's land managers are just willfully disregarding the law. They're just simply not doing what's necessary and needed to be done. In any other profession, a failure rate this high would lead to a sea change of agency priorities, policies, and personnel. It's really unacceptable, and it needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. Finally, you know, one of the biggest issues of the day is this drought that we've been experiencing in the Western United States and really throughout the entire country. The Western United States is in the midst of one of the worst drought conditions in over 1,200 years. Scientists are calling this really aridification. It's the new normal. It's going to be hotter and drier in the West for the foreseeable future. There's no indication that these conditions are going to let up. And you know, if you combine that with 150 years of continuous livestock grazing, you know, we've already seen ecological state changes in a lot of the Southwest and Great Basin regions. You know, the failure of the Bureau to really get in front of this problem, do land health evaluations, do new NEPA assessments, include drought, climate change, aridification, biodiversity loss into their management planning for grazing is really causing irreparable harm to native plants and wildlife and these ecosystems that we all cherish and really depend on in so many ways. So that's, I'll turn it over to Melissa here for the last bit, and then we'll take questions.
So Again, our analysis is based on publicly available data. All that we've done is classified allotments and placed them on a map. And what our analysis has shown is that rather than using the FLTMA 402c2 exemption to catch up on these really critical environmental reviews, the agency is instead preferentially using them to avoid addressing known conflicts on public lands, including conflicts with wildlife species, which include threatened and endangered species, including conflicts with the monument designations, cultural resources, recreational resources, and using them to continue status quo grazing when, if they had done an analysis, they would be required to reduce the amount of livestock grazing and the degree of grazing pressure on these resources. So this is really, this points to a deliberate use of this FLTMA 402c2 exemption to avoid carrying out their mandated responsibility to responsibly manage Western public lands. And again, I want to thank Josh for all of his help on this. At the bottom of this presentation, which you will all have access to, you can see the origins of this data, the permit schedule information system, which is a publicly available database by the Bureau of Land Management. We've got the historic records here under view the data. You can link directly to an Excel document that shows the records from previous years. And here are all of our the data layers that we've used. If you want to conduct your own analysis, you're welcome to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa and Josh. That was a lot of information, but I think hopefully you've distilled it down to have our audience recognize there's a big problem on public lands. So we'll open it up for questions now. If you want to type a question in the chat or raise your hand using the reaction button on the Zoom screen, we'll be happy to take questions. It's also possible that we've just explained it so well that everybody understands it. No questions. Okay. Well, I've put Josh and Melissa's emails. Oh, here's a question from Kathy. What can we do to raise awareness? Josh, do you want to handle that one?
Sure. Well, we're going to make this as public as possible, you know. So one of the ways to raise awareness is simply just to get the information out there, to relay that the Bureau has a problem on their hands, that this problem affects all of the rest of the Bureau's mission, really, and the administration's priorities. It's disingenuous for the administration to go forward with a program like America the Beautiful 30 by 30 and ignore the impacts of livestock grazing and ignore the fact that they're not even looking at the impacts of this activity that is permitted and discretionary on the public lands and even these so-called protected public lands. So I think, you know, we'll make this information public. We'll get it out there. We're counting on you and the media to help us raise awareness about this as well. We think this is a really important story that needs to be told in conjunction with peers' land health data. I think the two really go together well to tell the full picture. And then it just needs to come up in all of these conversations. You know, grazing is often, you know, the proverbial elephant in the room. You know, it's clearly one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest impacts happening on public lands. Yet it's one of the issues that is constantly ignored and not discussed for you know, what are probably mostly cultural reasons and the difficulty of the conversation. But we need to have those conversations.
Thanks, Josh. Vickery Eckhoff has asked a question. Who at BLM is responsible for responding to these concerns? I'll let Josh take that one too.
Sure. Thank you. So we've actually presented this data to the BLM already. We gave them the first shot at seeing it. So we had meetings with the upper level management at the BLM to explain what the issues were. We gave them some ideas for what we thought they could do to solve the problem. And it's going to take that upper level management and leadership to do it. What we need is a cultural change at the agency to make sure that livestock grazing and its impacts are elevated as one of the highest priorities for the agency's managers. I think one of the things that we didn't really talk about here, because there's a lot of information, but Congress has not provided the funding to the agency over the years that it really needs to manage the vast portfolio it has on public lands. So the agency has staffing problems. We know that this is true, but there's also internally decisions being made about staffing and priorities that have shunned grazing and elevated other issues. And really what happened is when Congress passed the permanent rider in 2014, I think what we saw were state directors taking resources away from the range program. Instead of saying, okay, we got a break, let's catch up on our backlog, let's put more resources into the range program, they suddenly saw management of the range program as completely optional. And when it's optional, it was neglected. So we have less range staff now that are looking at these lands. We have less staff trained how to do NEPA, how to do land health evaluations. And the BLM needs to shift some of their priorities. They need to take funding and move it around, hire more range staff. Congress needs to give them more money and issue specific direction that they should do those things. We're hopeful that the upper level management, the new management at BLM, is amenable to those messages and will direct the managers to follow through and get it done.
It's worth noting that it is possible, looking at the difference between Montana and nearly every other state. Montana is accomplishing this. I mean, it's not a problem that can't be solved. It is a matter of prioritization. You can go back to the chart here. I would like to add, we obviously didn't cover the Forest Service in this presentation. The Bureau of Land Management makes their data publicly available. The Forest Service really doesn't. And recently, Western Watersheds has done the work of acquiring Forest Service data. And the initial analysis there on their grazing lands is that it's even worse. They also are able to use the FLTMA 402C2 exemption, and they've done it to an even greater degree than the Bureau of Land Management. So look for work from us in the future, exposing the Forest Service's preferential use of the FLTMA 402C2 exemption to avoid managing their resources as well.
And that includes significant portions of designated wilderness too. So, I mean, those issues of protected, the protected lands, grazing is still happening in a lot of those areas, and the Forest Service is really not managing it at all. They're just allowing status quo grazing to occur. They're not looking at the impacts, and they're not making changes to management to address them.
Okay, Claire Carlson asked, can you speak to the relationship between BLM and ranchers? Could this be a reason for the lack of NEPA review?
I mean, sure, I'll take that on. I don't think I'm going to be able to provide you with like this specific example or that specific example, although I know others could, and I know that they exist. But a lot of the BLM range managers are part of ranching families in the local communities and where they live and work. So there is definitely a conflict of interest within the BLM's management of the grazing program. So you can imagine how difficult it might be for a local range manager to tell their uncle or their nephew or their neighbor that in fact their grazing is unsustainable, it's destroying resources, they're going to have to cut their AUMs by half because the law requires it. That's difficult. We know that that's difficult. You know, and I think the agency really needs to figure that problem out. That I don't think that's for us to figure out. You know, we can make suggestions to the BLM about what they need to do to bring accountability to the range program. We think one of the best things that they could do would be to have more of an interdisciplinary approach. You know, that's what actually goes on in Montana and why they're more successful. Montana does land health evaluations with their full professional staff in a number of their field offices. They use an interdisciplinary approach. The hydrologist is there, the wilderness experts are there, the forestry people are there, the wildlife biologists are there, the botanists are there. They're all there assessing these landscapes. It's not left just to the range staff to determine what's going on and make decisions about how to change it. And their entire staff works on the NEPA when they do NEPA on the allotments. They develop the alternatives together. They work together. That's a model that actually the BLM has in their handbooks and manuals, but it's not followed throughout most of the agency. So they have some tools, they have some ways that they could fix it, you know, already in their playbook, and we can see that it can work. But you know, the culture of the agency is a big problem. We need accountability. We need job performance to be evaluated based on how healthy the lands are. You know, managers should be evaluated on how the land is doing under their control, how much they're doing to change management to get it in better condition. And we just don't see that. That's not the way the BLM looks at performance from their staff. And you know, in another industry, that's obviously what you would do. You know, if everything's failing and your job is to manage it and you're not doing anything to make changes to the management, it continues to fail and get worse. That's not going to look so good, you know, when you're up for review. For whatever reason at the BLM, that doesn't seem to make any difference.
Thank you. Vickery said BLM issues virtually no news releases about livestock grazing. Mainstream media doesn't hear about this issue and needs to. And I would just jump in and say that this analysis that we've done is actually news to the agency. They have all of the data, but as far as we know, they've never analyzed it and tried to determine exactly how far behind they've been getting. Also, you know, sage-grouse, I'll jump on this too. I mean, sage-grouse, we've been saying that the land use management plans kick the can down the road. And this is what we mean. They kick it down the road to these site-specific analyses to do implementation that are protective, to protect habitats. And if they're never getting to the point down the road where they implement it, then the sage-grouse management plans are really not for grazing, not worth more than the paper they're printed on.
And one of the recommendations we made to the agency was that they issue direction that these directions in the plans are implemented immediately. They go into effect immediately, and then they can use the NEPA process to determine whether that's the appropriate management. So kind of flip it on its head. You know, create interim standards. Say that these are the standards that go in place today, and then we'll take a hard look and decide whether that's appropriate or we can change them, rather than do it the other way, where we've seen that no changes ever occur because the analysis isn't getting done.
It's the same situation for bighorn sheep. I'll note bighorn sheep, there's an IM that directs the agency to take certain steps when it's been demonstrated that domestic sheep pose a risk to them, but that occurs at a site-specific level. And so what we've seen is 83% of the allotments getting renewed without NEPA, and therefore that direction is never implemented. It's a way for the agency to avoid making these uncomfortable changes that are really necessary to protect an iconic Western species.
I think we all have hope that the Biden administration is receptive to this information and intends to take it into account in their future planning. We just really want to raise the awareness for everybody that, you know, this is a huge ongoing problem on Western public lands. So if you have additional questions, you can email any of us. Happy to talk more, happy to provide the data. And we really thank you for your time today and your interest in learning about this.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.